This week on Conservative Crossroads, what is conservatism's core principle? John Hood says it's freedom. Josh Hammer says it's virtue. Freedom or virtue? Coming up on Conservative Crossroads now. Welcome back to Conservative Crossroads, the program where conservatives lean into their differences rather than deny them. I'm Henry Olson, Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and your host and moderator for this program. This week, our discussion is over first principles. Is freedom or virtue the main principle underlying American conservatism? I'm joined by John Hood, president of the John William Pope Foundation and co-founder of the Freedom Conservatism Project, and Josh Hammer, host of The Josh Hammer Show and senior editor-at-large at Newsweek. Each person will have 5 minutes to make an opening statement, followed by 40 minutes of mutual discussion and Q&A. Each will then have 2 minutes, in reverse order of the opening statements, to offer concluding remarks. We mutually decided prior to the program that John will go first. John, you're up.
Well, thank you very much, Henry and Josh. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today and talk a little bit about the past, present, and future of American conservatism. I got involved in the movement in the 1980s at the tail end of the Reagan era and spent many decades running organizations, funding organizations, building organizations, and training people. And there has never been a moment when everyone agreed on every aspect of what it meant to be an American conservative, much less going international and trying to come up with some sort of non-country specific definition of conservatism, which I think is probably doomed to futility. So just in the case of American conservatism, I would submit that you cannot have an American conservative movement that is not dedicated to freedom. That doesn't mean it isn't dedicated to more than freedom, because of course it is, and freedom and virtue are essential to the success of the American project and to the success of a conservative movement that attempts to conserve the American project. But I do believe in the indispensability of liberty, of freedom, as part of what makes American conservatism what it is, distinctive and successful. There are lots of different ways to think about this term freedom. I think that there is a reasonable triad of definitions that you have personal freedom, you have political freedom, and you have national freedom. And that's more or less in order, in the sense that most American conservatives believe that freedom, that our rights as individuals are not grants of the state. They're not created by some external group or given to us by an authority figure, that they are given to us by God, that they are part of what it means to be a human being, and that they pre-exist the state. Now, of course, the individual doesn't exist in the real world on its own. It's part of families, which are chosen, and then you're born into them, which is not chosen, and communities. The nation is something that matters, and national freedom is important, but the nation, as we understand it today, comes along very late in the history of the human species, and certainly even in the history of recorded time. The nation, as we understand it today, is a modern creation, a 19th century creation in most of the world, certainly in Europe and in places that are influenced by Europe. So to start with the individual and start with personal individual freedom is, again, I think, essential, though it is not entirely the story. When we apply that principle more broadly, we think about the right to do with your property and your labor as you will, as long as you do not injure or restrain someone else's ability to do the same. It does mean the freedom to form families and nurture children and create communities and create businesses, create private associations of various kinds that make life worth living. I'm a committed fusionist, so I believe that the political principle that is above the others is freedom, but it is not the principle that guides our life. That is, in fact, virtue. It's human flourishing, and that freedom is necessary for human flourishing to be possible, for people to live virtuously, and for virtue to thrive and prosper. I think it is notable that America, which had a tradition of localism, a tradition of subsidiarity, a tradition of religious pluralism and diversity, not one single denomination, one single faith, that America is precisely the place where religious congregations, while they need a lot of help and they have declined significantly, but not as much as in countries that had established churches, which I think was actually bad for religious belief and religious institution. So these are not just theoretical clarifications, theoretical distinctions, and theoretical priorities. They matter in the real world. They apply to lots of issues that we're facing today, from rising costs to educational problems to the fertility problem that faces America and much of the world, our national security threats, threats to our personal liberties, our freedom of speech, our freedom of association. These are all real problems that deserve effective solutions. And it is my belief and the belief of people who aspire and adhere to freedom conservatism that you cannot have a meaningful understanding of these problems and effective responses to them if you deny the indispensability of individual liberty as part of what founded America, part of what makes American flourishing possible, and that is what we're seeking to conserve.
Thank you, John. Josh, you're up.
Okay, well, this is a wonderful conversation. So, Henry, thank you for organizing it, and John, thank you for engaging with us here as well. I really love these first principles conversations. I think it's very easy to get lost in the weeds. Look, I host a daily show, so it's very easy to get lost in the weeds of what is happening on Capitol Hill on a given day. But every so often, I think it's important to kind of step back and remind ourselves what we're actually doing here. So I have a different view, unsurprisingly, which is why I've been asked, I think, to give the alternative position here in this conversation. I think it's first worth noting at the outset that I think that this is less of a pick one or the other style debate. I certainly don't think that John is a Randian and anarcho-libertarian. He's calling himself a fusionist, and I hope that no one thinks of me as a quasi-authoritarian. God forbid. I obviously place a great deal of value on liberty as well. Rather, my proposition is that liberty, properly speaking, must be ordered and subsumed to some broader things. So let's kind of go ahead and step back. So my basic contention, Henry, is that conservatism from an American perspective, which in turn goes back to the Anglo-American perspective, because my take on America's founding was that it was heavily inspired by our English forebears. That, of course, among other things, is why the English common law is the law of the land at a state level today in 49 of the 50 states. Louisiana remains an exception. And the broader Anglo-American tradition, I think, was heavily predicated above all on the Bible and Scripture. And there's any number of indications of this. We probably don't have time to do so, at least in these introductory remarks there. There are any quotes to the effect that the English common law was above all inspired by Scripture. Joseph Story, the great Supreme Court justice writing in the 19th century, essentially says that Christianity is part of the English common law itself, actually, there. And as part of this kind of Anglo-inspired view that I take of our conservative inheritance there, I think it's worth noting that perhaps the most famous of all the English conservatives, Edmund Burke, famously says, of course, that men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their appetites. But this is not just an Anglo or English phenomenon. Some of the greatest American founders spoke very clearly about this exact topic. So George Washington is one of his probably lesser known quotes. I think it's nonetheless very highly instructive. George Washington actually in 1783, in his Circular to the States, a missive that was written around the time of the surrender of Cornwallis to Washington at Yorktown, he famously writes, Washington in 1783, he said that, quote, arbitrary power is most easily established on the ruins of liberty abused to licentiousness. That was in 1783, years before the Constitution was even written. Washington, of course, famously in his farewell address about a decade and a half later, would famously urge that let the fool indulge himself with the notion that anything other than revealed religion can possibly sustain the morality upon which this entire experiment in ordered liberty depends. And his successor as president, John Adams, was, of course, perhaps arguably best known for his quotes that the Constitution was made for a wholly moral and religious people. It is inadequate for any other. So where is this coming from? Where is this notion coming from? Well, it's coming from the notion that we have free will as human beings, but we must use that free will in order to choose freely. This is definitely the Bible's view of free will. Certainly, the children of Israel, all throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, are very stubborn. They're referred to as a stiff-necked people. Nonetheless, they know what they must do. They are instructed to use that free will in order to do that which is virtuous, in order to do that which is right. And only then can they be what Exodus 19 refers to as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So this notion of this collective holiness, of this collective common good, of this notion that is more than just the result of idiosyncratic utility maximization. This notion of thing is really deeply ingrained in the Anglo-American and indeed in the distinctly American conception of what conservatism is. And just in brief there, I think that the preamble of the Constitution really gets at this. And I emphasize this a lot in my legal scholarship when I talk about what I refer to as common good originalism. So the preamble, of course, reads, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So the our posterity part at the end is this almost Burkean notion of this notion of society as an intergenerational compact between the dead, the living, and the yet unborn. A lot of these other enumerated ends of governance, general welfare, more perfect union, common defense, are overtly commonweal, common good, nationalistic goals there. Even though, and I'll end with this, because I think I'm running out of time, even this, the notion of securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves, they're interested there, if we're being good readers, what they meant there. The liberty is intrinsic to an extent, but it's mostly instrumental. They're mostly interested in the blessings. What do you do with that liberty? Because again, this is the biblical worldview. The notion is that you have free will, you can exercise your liberty, but will you do it in a way that conduces to the transcendental, that conduces to objective truth, and thereby you actually get the blessings. So that is my view, in short, I guess, of the proper subsuming of liberty to order, and that's how we get the American notion of order, liberty.
Well, thank you, Josh. Who would like to question one another about anything, about the principles or about their application in public policy?
Well, I'll first say, as Josh said at the beginning, we are really having a conversation about emphasis, about priorities, or even historical understanding. You said a number of times our Anglo-American heritage or English common law. I certainly believe that many Americans at the time of the founding would have thought in those terms, but not all. In fact, arguably not the majority who would have, for example, disagreed with your use of the term English. My Scotch, Irish, and German ancestors, most of whom were revolutionaries, detested the Church of England. If they thought they were fighting the British so that they could have a more secure, established church, they would have switched sides. They certainly would have understood the common law. They would not have associated it simply with England. They would have associated it more broadly with their rights as citizens of the empire as a whole. So the Scots, the Irish, the Germans, there were some Scandinavians, there were some French Huguenots, who, by the way, would have had a lot of doubts about. I mean, I agree with you about free will, but they would have had some pretty significant disagreements with you about what the Bible says about free will. So I'm just a little hesitant, and I'm curious. I'm sure you've had those sorts of challenges in the past, that these kinds of terms that we use today may not, in fact, have been the way all the people who are, maybe some of the founders wrote it in these terms, but the people who pioneered the colonies, who fought the wars, who established the local governments and established the provincial governance that became the state governments, they had a more universal, not like world spanning, and there's no such thing as nation. That's not what I'm saying, but they would have thought about the American experiment that they were in the process of creating or preserving or whatever, as something that is more of a blend than simply a specific inheritance of Anglo settler and English, specifically English traditions. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so look, there's obviously some truth to this. I obviously don't claim that it was solely English influence that inspired the founders. I think there are any number of examples of other contemporaneous Enlightenment thinkers, folks like Diderot and Montesquieu, perhaps above all, there on the European continent, who I think were very influential to American thinking. They definitely were familiar with their ancient Greeks, with Aristotle and Plato and so forth. I think a little less inspired by the Greeks than some people sometimes claim, but they definitely were aware of them. And to your point, look, there obviously were some very high profile American founders, especially the more Francophilic, let's call it, wing of the American founding, folks like Jefferson, folks like Thomas Paine, who did not have any interest whatsoever in trying to continue or inherit and redirect and repurpose really anything from the English inheritance. But there were plenty of people who did, and there were plenty of folks there at the time of the founding who I think viewed the American Constitution as a reassertion, really above all, and a reassertion and incremental improvement of their previously granted and subsequently breached rights as Englishmen under the English Bill of Rights of the late 1680s and the Glorious Revolution back then. There's actually a very common line of thought. American history has typically written this out, actually, of our high school history textbooks, but there were a lot of folks who thought that they were Englishmen. They were entitled to certain civil rights according to the English Bill of Rights about a century prior to the American Revolution, and the Crown had infringed upon those rights. Now, there definitely was some notion of the broader, of the universal, of the natural. Obviously, Jefferson refers to the notion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, certain inalienable rights. Even folks like Hamilton, who took a slightly more perhaps Anglophilic view, that found that even Hamilton oftentimes used the rhetoric and the nomenclature of natural rights and universalism as well. So it was overall a mixed bag, but they were really, really, really heavily inspired, definitely by where we had come from, and we actually see that really in many features of our constitutional structure. I think it's kind of oversold, frankly, the notion that America pioneered federalism or the separation of powers. I don't think we pioneered either. We improved upon both. I think the American Constitution is the greatest source of self-governance ever written. But it's not really an accident where that came from. I mean, Parliament had just devolved power to Scotland and Wales in 1707, 1708, less than a century prior to the American Revolution. Even separation of powers, I mean, really, arguably goes back to Magna Carta, but at least it goes back to the 17th century, really, and the rise of Parliament as a meaningful check on the king. So a lot of what we take today really is still heavily inspired, definitely, by that English precedent. I totally agree with you, by the way, about the separation issue when it comes to the national separation, when it comes to the Church of England. But there is a very, very important asterisk and caveat here, and this might be potentially interesting fodder for continued conversation, which is that this notion of so-called separation of church and state was true at a federal level, although not textually speaking. The First Amendment famously just says that Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion, by which they meant a literal establishment, like the actual established Church of England. They definitely, so two things are true. One is they were not objecting to a broader ecumenical, cross-denominational notion of de facto establishment. I have argued repeatedly that ecumenical, call it ecumenical biblicism, you want to call it ecumenical Christianity, I'm fine with that. This really was the civic religion of the American founding, as writings like Washington's Thanksgiving Proclamation make abidingly clear just in the first year of his presidency. But the second thing there that I think is very interesting is that there were absolutely no established churches at the state level. In fact, most of the states had established churches well into the 19th century. Massachusetts, for instance, had an established church of Congregationalism, which didn't go away until 1833. I'm sure that Elizabeth Warren shrieks at that when she thinks about that today. In fact, the Establishment Clause was actually really just a federalism provision. Speaking of America's improvement on federalism, as Clarence Thomas has noted time and time again there. So this notion of religiosity being not just, as some fusionists argue, not just for the private sphere, but this notion that it was really kind of to be enforced, albeit gently enforced, by the force of law and universal customs and norms in the civic and the political sphere. I think that was really also heavily ingrained in our culture and in our politics.
Well, I think that opinion was certainly prevalent among parts of the American colonies and very unpopular among other parts of America. That's what I'm trying to say, is that thank goodness that we finally got rid of the establishment at the state level. They were often tyrannical. They used taxpayer money to fund one domination at the expense of others. They sometimes invalidated marriages in order to steal people's land. Quakers were oppressed by it for 150 years. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians. some of the German pietists and German Lutherans and Reform, the French Huguenots who thought they'd left that behind. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't a sort of, as you say, a sort of an ecumenical, including among the most enlightened people at the time, Jews and others who were not even Christians. It was a sort of an ecumenical sense that public virtue was necessary. I think your John Adams quote is so important for people to dwell on and think about. I do not think it was the argument that, in fact, I know Adams was not arguing, therefore, let's have some sort of mandatory or requirements about church or requirements about protestations of faith in order to serve an office or anything of the sort. What he was getting at is a profound conservative insight that human beings are inherently flawed, inherently fallen. We can create institutions that minimize the ill effects of temptation and vice and poor decisions, but we cannot eliminate them. It's not possible. And so what you have in Adams and in Jefferson, again, they disagreed about a number of things, but they didn't disagree about the importance of public virtue, civic virtue. What you have is a sort of a belt and suspenders approach, which I think you properly point out the U.S. Constitution is that, and that's what makes it the greatest of the founding documents of any country in the world, is in fact, it does take seriously the institutional safeguards, the institutional requirements that are necessary to minimize the abuse of power and to maximize human flourishing, the ability of governments to do their limited tasks well. That is the classical Republican aspect. I always think about the American Revolution as a mix of classical republicanism and classical liberalism. They didn't necessarily use either of those terms. And there is not a clear delineation between the two, but they're certainly there. And the classical Republican notions, as you say, not original to the founders, not even original to the people at the time, but dating back at least scholars reading Tacitus and reading Plutarch and thinking about ancient Rome. As you say, not so much about ancient Greece, but definitely ancient Rome, which itself was influenced, as we know, by the Greek colonists in Italy. Thinking a lot about how power goes awry, how power can be abused, and creating structures, incentives, and institutions that try to deliver what government is supposed to deliver without this accumulation of power and abuse of power, and recognizing that all of that's necessary and it's insufficient. It's insufficient. And we see this today. I mean, we have problems with our constitutional design and the effectiveness of the checks and balances in our system. But also, you can't draw up some sort of plan, some sort of set of institutions and get them enacted and try to follow them if you don't also have expectations that your leaders will have a base level of commitment to the public good instead of enriching themselves, that they will not attempt to not just defeat the other side in elections or in legislative debates, but literally try to destroy them. That is, in fact, what unraveled Greek city-states, unraveled arguably Rome itself. And so I do believe the founders thought a lot about that. I don't think it means that they subordinate liberty to virtue, perhaps in the way you mean, and we could just disagree perhaps about the definitions or what we think they meant, but rather that you need the belt, you need institutional safeguards. I mean, a good example would be the U.S. Constitution itself, which was written in 1787 at a convention that was arguably extra legal. The delegates went to Philadelphia not to write a new constitution, as far as they knew, or as far as most of the people who sent them there. They were there to make amendments to the Articles of Confederation. James Madison and the Virginia delegation arrived with a different plan in mind. And by the way, I think they were probably right, but there was a kind of a runaway convention, is what it was. And they ended up with a plan to significantly empower the national government. They went out to the states to ratify the Constitution. And not to get into great detail, but the ratification would have failed if Madison had not acceded to the demands of his critics and the others and realized we are not going to get this. I'm from a state, North Carolina, that actually rejected the Constitution. But the other states, like Virginia, would not have approved it if it was not clearly signaled, yes, we've got this constitutional structure. Yes, we think it'll be good. We need suspenders too. And in this case, a Bill of Rights. So that even though in theory the government wasn't supposed to have the power to violate all these rights, in practice we're going to also put the natural rights in there in the Constitution itself as an extra check. Hamilton, as we know, wasn't a big fan of this, but I think came around to it eventually, understanding it was necessary. And we would not have a country if that compromise in the original conception had not been implemented. This is a good example of, I guess, my broader point, which is when we talk about how the American founding happened and what the founders thought, we should start from the assumption that there is no such monochromatic category as the founding. They had lots of different views. They went to war with Britain on somewhat different grounds, depending upon what state you were in. They had somewhat different views about what the subsequent U.S. Constitution should look like, what the various state powers should be versus the national. And that was a robust debate that continues until the present day. In order for this to work effectively, in my view, you have to start with protecting individual rights, rights of small groups, rights of state, well, really powers of states, and see the national government as having power delegated to it by the people and by their state legislatures, by their state governments, rather than starting with the nation as the building block of our polity, which I don't think is actually a good way to ground this in history.
A few things just come immediately to mind. Look, the Bill of Rights. I don't object to the Bill of Rights by any stretch of the imagination. There, I think the Bill of Rights are perfectly just fine. I think to the extent to which the Bill of Rights codifies a notion of natural rights is disputed. Most natural rights theorists, of course, point to the Ninth Amendment. Bob Bork famously said that the Ninth Amendment is an inkblot and is totally inscrutable. I think your mileage may vary as to whether it is either of those two things or something perhaps in the middle. I think the more important notion about the Bill of Rights is the Antonin Scalia notion that the Bill of Rights were arguably superfluous precisely because they were at least arguably superfluous, because it's not actually doing the meaningful work. It's not really doing the meaningful work as far as what makes the Constitution great. Scalia was very fond of noting how the Soviet Constitution had a quote-unquote Bill of Rights. Any of other authoritarian regimes throughout history have had some version of a so-called Bill of Rights. Rather, the genius of our Constitution is in its structural features. Above all, of course, in the systems of separation of powers and of federalism itself. And above all, really, that's predicated on a proper, I would argue, religiously and biblically inspired view of man and of all man's inclinations towards shortcomings and hubris and thirsting and zeal for power and all of his moral shortcomings and foibles, et cetera, et cetera. I'm thinking really above all of Madison's famous passage in Federalist 51, this notion that ambition must be made to counteract ambition, precisely because men are not angels. And we therefore have this problem of how to restrain and constrain the impulses of men here in this realm. And that's it's a very religious, very biblical worldview. Again, I don't think John and I would necessarily disagree on this there, but my point really more broadly is that when you look at what's really doing the meaningful work here, at what are the core features that make our Constitution great, I don't think that it is a historically unique love of liberty per se. I think that it is a love of government restraint, while simultaneously being open to the notion of prudential government power, by the way. So a very important part of what John said there is this notion that the convention was a runaway convention in 1787, which of course it was. And the Constitution that we got, clearly a marked improvement on their Articles of Confederation, which had remarkably failed when it came to all the debt that was accumulated during the Revolutionary War. And famously, it was shown to be completely ineffectual during Shays' Rebellion in Western Massachusetts, when it came to trying to put the militia out to quell the uprising for the indebted folks out there in Western Mass, and et cetera, et cetera. So the Constitution, clearly an improvement, but the Constitution is also clearly a much more national government friendly document than the articles that preceded it. Yes, they were terrified of tyranny, certainly, and that's broadly why the pro-Bill of Rights crowd won out over the anti-federalists, who, among others, were terrified of the notion of Bill of Rights. But the basic constitutional structure went out that empowered the federal government to do a lot more. We see that in Article 1, Section 8 when it comes to the Congress, and we see that when it comes to the residual powers in the executive power of Article 2. So, I don't necessarily take this take this notion that the national government is such an afterthought in America's constitutional structure. Certainly, the 14th Amendment, by the way, totally changes the game. So a couple of times, John, I think, has very gently and politely chided me for maybe putting a little too much emphasis on what the founders or some founders may have said, but subsequently we improved ... Well, arguably, the 14th Amendment here is a very powerful example. Listen, I mean, some people might argue that the 14th Amendment was mistaken. That's definitely not my stance. I think that is very much a Lincoln-inspired second founding, a refounding of America. Well, the 14th Amendment unambiguously then re-empowers the federal government yet again. And it was really thanks to the 14th Amendment that we were ultimately able to end Jim Crow segregation, of course, in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act.
You mean the 14th Amendment?
Yes, sorry.
That's what he's saying. He's just, I think he meant the 14th Amendment. Yes.
That's what I said. Or I thought I said that. Sorry. I apologize if I misspoke. But yes, of course, the 14th Amendment. Yes. So look,
I was wondering about the Fourth Amendment and the provision on the ban of unreasonable search.
Oh, no.
I was wondering what novel constitutional theory I was about to premiere on my show.
No, I apologize. I definitely meant the 14th Amendment, although I'm sure the Fourth Amendment would also be an interesting topic of conversation. Anyway, all that to say that the Constitution we have today and the relations between the national government and the states have indeed gotten too out of whack. I think at this point the national government clearly has taken too much power from the states. But all that's to say that as prescient and brilliant as Madison was writing in Federalist 51 about ambition counteracting ambition, his contemporaneous notion in Federalist 45 about how the national government is a government of few and defined rights, the powers reserved to states are numerous and indefinite. That's a truism insofar as it goes, but it is at least somewhat anachronistic in light, at least, of the 14th Amendment. So I think that's another added layer to a conversation here.
I'd like to just pose a question for both of you, which in the nature of this show, you can completely ignore because I'm just the moderator. But it strikes me that one of the things that interests people about this question is its application to various policy disputes. You'll often hear people advocating for virtue, argue for regulation of or return to regulation of sexual mores, or introduction of Christian motifs, or prayer in schools, 10 commandments being posted, and so forth. And people inclined to freedom conservatism, pushing back on that. Or in the economic sphere, people saying, well, the national interest suggests that we should do X or Y with trade or with regulation of business, and freedom conservatives also saying, well, wait a minute, my right trumps your national interest. And I was wondering if there was any sort of discussion that you thought would be helpful along that lines, or if we simply want to continue on the very interesting, pure philosophical discussion rooted in what did our founders intend and what type of republic hath they bequeathed to us.
Well, I think you have gently but firmly moved us towards being more about the applied questions of today, and I'll take that on. I think that the disputes among conservatives today are often about individualism, which we've already talked about a little bit. They're about federalism, which we were just talking on, the relative proportion of power between the federal government, states, local, private institutions, etc. Number 3 is pluralism, which I'm about to talk about. And number 4 is capitalism. These are the areas where we have some differences of opinion. And on the pluralism in particular, I simply think that in today's world, and maybe even in the world of 80 years ago, it is important to recognize both the importance that most people place on values and spiritual matters and grounding in religion in the education of children, and that if you attempt to do that purely through some sort of establishment, not of a particular denomination, but some sort of like public schools will lead school prayers, people in public schools, what you're going to end up with is constant conflict. I do sometimes chide some of my more secular friends about this. They seem to think that public schools, why would anybody think public schools would be religious? Actually, all public schools in America were religious all the way into the 1950s and 60s. They were simply Protestant. And so the real issue was that Catholics were being denied the ability to have their children educated as they wished. Protestants got what they wanted, and the Catholics did not. I think the solution today is not to attempt to return to making religion an explicit part of our public schools, but in fact, a prototypical American conservative, I would argue, free-con sort of policy, which is school choice, educational freedom, that we're going to have public resources spent to educate kids. All children in all states are going to have some sort of a civil right to receive education, but that parents will be able to direct where those dollars go, where their children go, so they can be in schools that are as close to what they want, not just in academics, but also in the values and the moral grounding that is necessary for a full and rounded education. And so I think that's the solution. And I think it's not just the abstract sense of pluralism, which I do believe in, and I do think that it is a prototypical American view, but that as a practical matter, it is simply impossible to imagine an alternative policy that will get us where we want to go other than educational freedom, which I do think is entirely consistent with our constitutional history, our constitutional principles, and what people want right now in the 21st century, and has been one of the most successful reforms that conservatives have adopted and pushed through the states in the last 15 years.
So I'm definitely a proponent of school choice, and I have very, very few, if any, friends on the right who are not fans of school choice. So I think that's a position that is definitely a bit of a crossover from the free con school of thought, let's call it, versus the more nationalist or populist school of thought. So I have absolutely no objections to any of this. I come from a line of teachers, by the way. My mother, grandmother, great grandmother were all teachers. So no one has heard more horror stories of the teachers' unions than me, and that's definitely colored my position on this particular issue.
Both of my parents were also public school teachers and detested the unions. We have another point of agreement.
Ah, wonderful. Yes, I love that. But in the interest of keeping things more interesting for the listeners and the viewers, I probably should emphasize where I don't agree, which is the area of the Ten Commandments and this notion of public morality and religiosity, more generally speaking. So this is actually an active litigation, right? This is actually a hot case happening right now out of both Texas and Louisiana. The Texas case was mooted for somewhat arcane reasons, but the Louisiana case is very much still hot. And it was fairly recently, just a couple months ago, that the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Louisiana's law that would put the Ten Commandments in all public school classrooms from K through 12. And the basic historical argument lurking here in the background, perhaps not said explicitly by the Fifth Circuit judges, but the basic notion, to use a somewhat charged term that I first used in a speech probably about 4.5 years ago, but I guess I will bring back here. The implicit notion, as I was getting at earlier in our conversation today, is that America is essentially a country founded on what I sometimes cheekily refer to as ecumenical integralism. It's not Catholic integralism, as some folks have there. It's this notion of ecumenical integralism, biblical ecumenical integralism. How else to interpret the John Adams notion that the Constitution really was made for a religious and moral people and is wholly inadequate to any other kind of people? How else to interpret Washington's farewell address, famous party message there? The notion that the Ten Commandments should not be part of our instruction from a very early age onward, I think is frankly ludicrous. These are the very notions that have shaped not just the American way of life, but frankly the modern world. I see absolutely no problem whatsoever, for that matter, with ecumenical school prayers in the schools. There's a court case called Engel versus Vitale in the 1960s that famously took the school prayer and the Bibles out of schools. I very much would like to see a world whereby that was put back into place. I don't claim that this would be a panacea, by the way, but this notion that public institutions cannot lean on faith, again, is just totally irreconcilable with American history. You know, one of my favorite, this is kind of a funny thing about to say, one of my favorite things that Barack Obama ever did, and it's a very short list, but one of my favorite things that Barack Obama did was he gave a speech in 2006, just 2 years into a Senate term, on the floor, and it was the National Day of Prayer or some other religious-themed day in the Senate, and he basically says that those who tell believers to keep their faith out of the public square are speaking and living a lie, because there is no such thing as just taking your principles, your morality, your faith out of the public square. And Barack Obama himself, if memory serves, there's a paraphrase, a pretty close paraphrase, Barack Obama said in his 2006 speech that what is the law but a codification of morality? We hear this debate sometimes. I hear some of my more libertarian-leaning friends and colleagues say, "Oh, you can't legislate morality." Says who? Literally, what is law but the codification of morality? What is the prescription on homicide, the prescription on rape, and all sorts of other terrible things, other than being derived from Genesis 1:27, the notion that we are all made in the image of God? You can't have these things without that broader context. This July 4th, we'll celebrate the 250th anniversary of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence there, a document that I think more classical liberals, more folks in the free con school of thought are typically fond of invoking, perhaps, than folks on my side of this debate. I happen to be more of a fan of Declaration than I think some of my friends and colleagues, but let's leave that aside for now. I think the more interesting thing about the Declaration is this. Jefferson famously says that it is self-evident, because it is self-evident that these rights are natural, and that they are inalienable. Of course, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And me, looking back 250 years now in the future, I say, well, really, would it actually have been self-evident? Is it actually self-evident to all men throughout the world? Is it self-evident to the goat herders in the mountains of Afghanistan, members of the Taliban, that all men are entitled to certain inalienable rights, among them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Is it inalienable to sub-Saharan tribal African warlords? Is it inalienable to some of the Han ethnic supremacists in the Politburo and the Chinese Communist Party who are committing a soft genocide on the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province? And the answer to all these questions is obviously no. It is obviously not self-evident. So then that raised the question then, why did Jefferson, who himself, as we already noted, was part of this more Francophilic kind of very liberal Enlightenment-inspired wing of the founding, how could even he say that it is self-evident? And the answer is that he was writing and thinking, indeed he was living and breathing, in a certain milieu, in a certain civilizational inheritance, in a certain context, where things like the Ten Commandments, where things like Genesis 1:27, where things like Leviticus 19:18, which is the golden rule, this notion to treat the stranger as your fellow, where these are the basic ingredients of how we live our day-to-day life without thinking about it there. So with all that in mind, I think the notion that some of these basic building blocks cannot and should not be part of the civics process, part of the education process there, I think it's folly. And again, I don't think that it is a panacea by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think that putting the Ten Commandments in every public school classroom in America is going to make, by itself, it will not make America a great country, right? But I think that is one small part in trying to kind of bring us back on the road to what we once were.
So I take your point there. I think we agree on one thing, which is that it is likely not to have a very large effect. It's just hard to believe that it would matter very much. And this is not spiritual, it's not religious education. It is simply something that people can look up. So let me get to a couple of points you made and very quickly. First of all, of course, morality is the basis of law. It's not really what the dispute's about. The dispute is about morality about what subjects. When you're talking about the slaying of a human being, of course, that is prohibited by the Bible, and it is a violation of the basic social contract of, if you're going to have people live together, there's certain things you have to respect other people's bodies, their liberty, their property. On the other hand, there are plenty of biblical prescriptions which have the force of moral law, which we would never want to legislate, regarding what you can eat, how you worship, certain other kinds of transactions between human beings, certain rituals that you're supposed to follow. These are not devoid of moral content in Christianity, Judaism, and other religions. And I know you don't think we should legislate those. So it's not a question of whether we should legislate morality, it's on what subjects. And it turns out the on what subjects is pretty straightforwardly an application of rights to life, liberty, and property. Which absolutely are moral obligations on people to respect other people's rights and legitimate areas of legislation, while other things are not. As far as what the founders thought regarding religion, again, I think it is a fair point that the founders had a variety of views about this. Some of them actually absolutely believed that state governments, at least, should be inculcating specifically religious, specifically Christian, or even specifically Congregationist values, as John Adams would probably have thought in Massachusetts, which was the official church of Massachusetts. It's not the way other people thought about it. They absolutely believed the American experiment would fail if people weren't religious or people didn't have strong spiritual and moral foundations. But they didn't necessarily think you could do that through law. You could even do it through public schools funded with taxes. That you needed a robust, constant renewal of, constant rebirth, constant revival. Many of these founders and certainly their sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters were involved in these rather excited revivalist movements during the 19th century, none of which was to take over the government and like establish a Oliver Cromwellian war. It was we as members of this congregation or we as members of this community should renew our commitment to God and each other and the Bible, not at all public policy. It wasn't about the government. It was about human beings doing things in their families and in their churches and in their communities, not necessarily, and therefore here's our 10-point plan of what to get through the New York legislature. I just think that there's room for all of these sorts of takes, which in my view argues for the importance of recognizing freedom, the classical liberal part of the bundle with classical republicanism that makes the American revolution successful, that makes it exceptional, that makes it worth preserving.
Yeah, my reading of the history is just quite different. I don't really know how else to say it. I mean, let's take a very obvious example. So, blasphemy was actually prosecuted at a state level well into the 19th century.
It was outrageous that it was prosecuted, and finally they got rid of that.
Well, I don't agree that it was outrageous, but it was prosecuted.
You know what blasphemy meant? If not simply did you believe in God or not, it was unfortunately, the charges were much more egregious than that. You had to believe in it wasn't just, declaring that you didn't believe in God. It was repudiating various precepts of a particular religion.
Yeah, of course. But okay. We don't
need, this is not a minor thing. This was a tyrannical act that certainly Jefferson and Madison, who had witnessed the persecution of Baptists. It's one of the reasons why they put the religious freedom statute into the Virginia law. It took them many years to make it happen, and they thought it was very important.
Okay, let's take a much more interesting contemporaneous example. Right. I'd be curious if you think that pornography is entitled to First Amendment protection.
The First Amendment was not really intended to cover that kind of expression. It was really about political.
That doesn't really answer the question, though. But I take it.
It is. I said that's not a First Amendment question.
Well, it's only relevant if one takes an original intent approach to constitutional interpretation. So you're saying that it's not covered by the First Amendment.
Pornography as a product is not the same thing as political speech, which is what the First Amendment was originally designed to do.
Okay.
But I don't see a lot of the value other than
is speech only protected if it's political speech? If it's not political speech, it's not automatically entitled to.
Because there are other protections of our individual.
So what's the line then between non-political speech, which is nonetheless protected by the First Amendment, versus pornography, which is conceitedly not political speech, but you say falls outside the boundaries?
What's the
limiting principle?
If your question is, does the government have the power to regulate pornography? It doesn't restrict. It's not restricted by the First Amendment. I agree. That doesn't mean it should regulate pornography, other than age consent requirements, in my view, simply because we have much more important things to use government power on.
I don't agree with that at all. I think pornography is one of the great diseases among Gen Z and millennial males, and all the studies.
I agree that it's a disease, and I'm not in favor of using the power of government to attack every single possible vector of every communicable disease. We just went through this. It is very important that we try to resist and constrain and deter the abuse of pornography and lots of other things. I'm just not persuaded that it is going to be a useful enterprise for at least state regulators, if not, it's certainly not federal regulators, when we have much more important questions, much more legitimate uses of coercive power of government. And I just don't think this is one of them. I don't think it's the same thing as political speech, though.
Okay. Well, we kind of just went through the whole thing where you conceded that it's not just political speech that's protected by the man, but fair enough. This is obviously...
No, the First Amendment is not the only protection of our freedom, is my point. You don't have to... It doesn't have to be implicated in the First Amendment to be one of our rights. That is in fact what the so-called ink blot and the 10th Amendment were about, is just because we've listed the right to trial by jury and lots of other things,
So do you think
doesn't
that
mean that everything we didn't list, the government can encroach on.
do you think that pornography is a Ninth Amendment protected and natural right that would put it
I do
above
not think it is
regulation?
certainly a federal matter. Exactly. That's a 10th Amendment question, but I do not think it is a federal matter. And I just don't think it even remotely is a federal matter. And when it comes to state use of police power, I think it will be appropriate to prioritize things that violates people's life, liberty, and property, of which we have many such violations, and they deserve the use of our police power.
Okay, look, this is obviously an area of profound disagreement. There's a late 19th century Supreme Court case out of Kansas that famously exposits the traditional view of the police powers of the states, and it's basically a three-headed stool. And the police powers of the states exist to protect morality. Henry's actually been a little bit of time since I've been to back in law school.
Religion, morality, and it was the third.
Meridian
It was a common phrase.
Morality, religion.
The
exact phrase is deeply escaping me. I'm punching myself. I will Google it after this and will come immediately back to me. Anyway,
that phrase was very common in many state constitutions.
Yes, this is obviously why the police power exists, and this is why it ought to exist in my view, if at minimum at a state level. When it comes to things like pornography, frankly, when it comes to things like flag burning, probably another area of disagreement, I would imagine, between John and myself. So
whose flag is it?
The Texas versus Johnson case of 1989 is, in my opinion, a tragically misguided decision there. The notion that taking any object, let alone a flag, the notion that taking any object and lighting it on fire, which is already a public safety hazard and potentially a lethal and hazardous act at that. The notion that this is a constitutionally protected right, I think, is absolutely ludicrous there. The First Amendment exists to protect, as John initially conceived before he started going a little further, exists to protect political speech. That is the entire purpose of the amendment. Is predicated on historical examples like Thomas Paine's famous pamphleteering around the Philadelphia town's commons, things like that. It has nothing to do with non-speech related actions.
If I want to hold a political protest to express a political view, at which I burn a flag that I own, that is absolutely a First Amendment violation.
It is not. You should
my flag. It's not your flag. If I burn your flag, you should have me arrested. If I burn my flag, you should maybe be very angry at me, and you should be, because I'd never burn a flag. But you're right that this is a pretty clear distinction, and I think if you took it to the voters, we would have a difference of opinion. We would have voters hearing from different points. You could have people agree or disagree with these propositions based on how you phrase the argument. If the argument is, it's my flag, I can do whatever I want to with my flag, that's different.
Yeah, an appeal to majoritarianism is an inherently weak argument. I mean, to put this in a much more drastic historical example, Stephen Douglas would have said the same thing. If you put to a majority vote the notion that black people are not human and should be subject to slavery there, then I would win as well. So would Stephen Douglas have kind of thumped his chest triumphantly against Abraham Lincoln up and down Illinois during the debates in 1858. So it's a very I'm born on Lincoln's birthday. Lincoln is actually my single greatest lodestar in all of American history.
I don't think Lincoln would agree with you about whether I get to burn my own flag.
I think he would have actually. Abraham Lincoln was a great student of John Marshall and Joseph Story. He was deeply inspired by, let's call it, the more nationalist, common good oriented school of thought when it came to jurisprudence, political economy, for which he famously cited Henry Clay as his greatest hero, because, like Henry Clay, he believed in tariffs. Plus, that you don't agree with, he believed in tariffs.
Lincoln had a fault, and that was it. He was enamored of Henry Clay, who had a very pronounced misunderstanding of basic economics.
Abraham Lincoln was the quintessential common good nationalist in American history, actually.
Yeah, he had some failings, but in general, I think he was one of our greatest presidents. But his affection for tariffs and controlling people's decisions and so forth is not one of them.
You probably don't agree with. I would imagine you don't agree with his suspension of habeas corpus either. So you clearly
sure I do. Of course, it was wartime. That's in fact entirely understandable under the Constitution. The suspension of habeas corpus during
not necessarily the way it was done. The argument is that it should have been done by Congress.
I tend to agree with that, but I also think it was probably necessary. I'm definitely not, even though I'm a Jacksonian, not a Clay guy. But like Jackson, I would have been very hostile to secession.
Okay, hostility to secession is a very different argument than accepting Attorney General Bates's legal justification for the unilateral suspension of the Great Writ. I
Oh,
personally
I
find
suspect
that
Jackson in wartime would have done the same thing that Lincoln did.
okay.
And Polk, who was one of my favorite presidents, absolutely would have done that if it came to it.
Okay.
In wartime, extremes are sometimes necessary to preserve the Union and win the war. I agree with that entirely. And again, we have now gotten far away from, unless, Henry, you think we're actually at the precipice of another civil war, and this is a very relevant application of our disagreements. I don't actually believe that's true. I think there's some people who love to proclaim things like that. I don't think Americans are surging with such mutual like recrimination and hatred that we're about to have, full-fledged civil war or widespread violence. I don't think that's the case. But I do think that these disagreements, while we have a lot of agreements, and we've talked about some of them today, I think some of these disagreements really are not only important and relevant to our current controversies about economics and the role of the state, and as Josh brings out the questions of pornography, and we didn't talk about drug abuse and addiction, but that's another thing I'm very concerned about. We can have differences of opinion about what to do about these things and still recognize that they are very real problems that face our country, even though our country is in many ways still better off than most of the rest of the world, in part because we have this foundational set of documents. I would say the Declaration and the Constitution fit together very well and have created a foundation for success and justice and freedom that I think has served America well and served the world well. And I want to preserve that. And that's why I'm a freedom conservative, because I think that it is essential to preserve those, including the commitment to liberty, that it's indispensable to the American project.
And apparently including the commitments to appealing to might makes right majoritarianism, such as Stephen Douglas in 858. So I guess there's
No,
that
I
as well.
was going the other. I think you misunderstood my point. My point was not that everyone would agree with me, that even if people disagreed with me, laws against flag burning and school prayers are actually still popular notions. I just think they're mistaken. I think you misunderstood where I was going with my analogy, but that's okay.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough.
Well, I need to call a stop to the questioning and the discussing because we're out of time for that segment. We need to move on to the concluding statements, this is always the unfortunate role of the timekeeper / moderator, because this was fascinating and we could have kept going. This could have been Plato's symposium, and we would have gone on until the wee hours of the morning. But I do need to do that, and I need to intervene and say, Josh, you have 2 minutes for closing statement, and we will end with John.
Sure. So it's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you again, Henry, for organizing it. I don't think that there is a tremendous amount of disagreement here between John. Clearly there's disagreement. It's basically a difference as to what should be more emphasized between liberty, even perhaps in its idiosyncratic strands, versus this notion of being tethered and ordered and anchored towards something greater, towards something transcendental. So we didn't get into a lot, right? So to take just one possible example here, when it comes to gender ideology, I'd be very interested actually in John's take on this. There, it is my contention that some idiosyncratic claims to individual quote unquote liberty, such as the quote unquote right to engage in chemical castration or genital mutilation on a teenager, or the quote unquote right to take an older, decades long running example, to the quote unquote right to abort your unborn child in the womb. This is not liberty. This might be an idiosyncratic assertion or invocation of liberty, but it is not liberty properly understood, because it is not the liberty by which the founders intended to secure the blessings of liberty, which is what the language they use in the preamble, because it is not a blessing of liberty. It is an idiosyncratic invocation of liberty. They were interested in the blessings of liberty because they understood, again, that human beings have free will. You also have a moral obligation to do the right thing and to actually make the correct decision. And on that latter note, it has always been viewed as wholly appropriate, and indeed it is wholly appropriate, not for the government necessarily to force you to choose, but to put a mild thumb on the scale. Yes, a thumb on the scale when it comes to legislation, when it comes to civic norms, when it comes to inculcating a universal culture, such as the ubiquity of blue laws on Sundays all throughout the 19th century, really into the 20th century, in some counties still today, actually, in some parts of rural America there. This is the stuff that really fostered a culture of ecumenical biblical decency in America, and is one of the things I think will get us back on the right track moving forward in the decades ahead.
John, the last word is yours.
So I agree with Josh that we have lots of agreements. And I'm not surprised by that. When I started with some colleagues, the Freedom Conservative Project, we pointed out to the National Conservatism Statement of Principles signatories that it's not that we disagree with you on not only specific issues necessarily, but even some parts of your statement, but that we thought there were some missing parts that were absolutely essential, liberty being one of them, and the implications of this for the policies and priorities of the 21st century in America. When I think about the staggering amount of federal debt, the declining enterprise, the entrepreneurship and creation of new opportunities for people, the educational problems we have, the problems with our healthcare system, the problems with our transportation system and housing opportunities for people so families can start out and buy homes and build families and build communities. Those are all critically important questions, which are not going to be settled by debates about whether we should have the Ten Commandments. I'm not against putting historically relevant documents in various public settings. I'm not against Christmas things on city property. None of those things greatly concern me, but I also don't think they speak to the key issues that are facing America right now that will determine whether we can preserve our experiment in freedom and self-government, where we can defend ourselves against our enemies, which are very hostile, as Josh properly points out, very hostile to those self-evident truths that Jefferson attempted to argue. Of course, self-evident meant something different to Jefferson than it does. It doesn't mean like self-proving. He meant something else. He's talking about empirical evidence that people should, that the evidence of their senses should have told them that this was true, not that it didn't need an argument. But anyway, freedom conservatism is indeed about preserving the American system itself, which we believe is based on both classical republicanism and classical liberalism. We need both. They reinforce each other. It's belt and suspenders time in America in the 21st century, as it has always been.
Well, thank you, Josh. Thank you, John. And thank you, listeners. Please join me, Henry Olson, again in 2 weeks for another episode of Conservative Crossroads. Take care.